Everyone knows what was stolen from Anakin Skywalker the night the Republic died. His wife, his identity, his name. His children split across the galaxy like evidence at a crime scene, hidden from the man who would become the most feared presence in the known universe. Obi-Wan Kenobi took one child to the desert. Bail Organa took the other to a palace. And Anakin Skywalker, now Darth Vader, was told his wife died, his children died with her, and that whatever love he had once carried into the light had been destroyed in a burning room on Mustafar. That is the story we accept. That is the foundation upon which the entire original trilogy rests. Luke grows up under twin sons, ignorant. Leia grows up in a Senate, ignorant. Vader hunts rebels, ignorant of what he is actually hunting. And the tragedy is designed with such surgical efficiency that we never stop to ask what the design was actually protecting. The answer, when you find it, is more uncomfortable than the question. Because the official story Vader separated from his children, the Empire secured, the Jedi Order erased, assumes one thing above all others, that the separation was the safest outcome. That raising Luke on Tatooine, under the quiet supervision of his uncle and a sand horizon, was the choice that saved the galaxy. That Vader, had he known, would have become something worse. That Luke, raised in darkness, would have become something irredeemable. But there is a question that the official story never survives long enough to answer. What if Vader had raised him? Not as a thought experiment, not as fantasy, as a genuine structural analysis of what would have existed, what kind of man, what kind of empire, what kind of galaxy if Anakin Skywalker had looked into his son's face before the lie took root, before the suit sealed, before the grief calcified into something that no longer remembered what it was grieving. What would Luke have become if the man who raised him was also the most dangerous being in the galaxy? And what is more unsettling, that the answer might be horrifying, or that it might not be? Start with what we know about Anakin Skywalker before the fall. Not the myth of him, not the tragedy of him, but the functional reality of who he was as a father figure before he was ever given the chance to be one. He was 22 years old when he lost his mother. That loss did not make him cold. It made him catastrophic. He massacred an entire Tuscan settlement. Men, women, children, not out of ideology, not out of strategy, but because something in him could not process grief without converting it into action. That is not the psychology of a man incapable of love. That is the psychology of a man for whom love and destruction exist in the same register. He does not stop feeling. He feels too much, and there is no architecture in him strong enough to contain it, which means something critical about what Vader would have been as a father if he had known. And this is where it becomes disturbing. The conventional wisdom is that Vader as father would have been a weapon pointed at a child, cold, militaristic, shaping Luke into an instrument of the Empire. That is the comfortable interpretation because it lets us keep the categories clean. Vader is dark, Luke is light. The separation was mercy. But Anakin Skywalker's entire arc, from Tatooine to Coruscant to Mustafar, is not the story of a man who learned to love power more than people. It is the story of a man who loved people so completely, so obsessively, that he was willing to burn every institution in existence to preserve them. He turned on the Jedi not because he stopped caring about justice, but because he decided that Padmé's life was worth more than the Jedi Order itself. He made an impossible calculation and chose the personal over the cosmic. That calculation does not disappear when he becomes Vader, which means someone needed to be aware of something before the choice to hide Luke was finalized. The question Obi-Wan and Yoda never fully answered, the one that lives underneath every scene in the original trilogy, is not, what if Vader found Luke? It is, what would Vader have become if he had never lost Luke in the first place? There is a difference, a profound one, A Vader who discovers Luke at age 19 after a decade of grief and Emperor service is one thing. A Vader who holds a newborn and understands immediately that the lie he was told that Padme died, that the children died with her, was a lie constructed by his own master, is something else entirely. That second Vader does not simply become a father. That second Vader becomes a man who understands he has been managed, controlled, that the Emperor told him Padme was dead because a living child was leverage, a reason to survive that Palpatine could not afford to give him. And that realization that Palpatine needed Vader broken, needed him without reason to hope, without someone to protect who was not the Emperor himself, would have changed everything before Luke spoke his first word. If that detail matters, then we need to understand what Vader's entire relationship with the Emperor was actually built on. Palpatine's control was never primarily physical. It was emotional. It was grief-based. It was the understanding that a man with nothing to live for except his master is the most loyal servant imaginable. The moment Vader had a child, a blood heir, a living extension of Padme, the Emperor's leverage, did not diminish. It inverted, which means someone was aware of this, someone calculated it. And the decision to hide the children was not only about protecting Luke from Vader, it was about protecting the Emperor from what Vader would become if he knew Luke existed. And that's only possible if Obi-Wan and Yoda understood on some level that Vader's attachment to his child might be stronger than his attachment to Palpatine, which is not a comforting thought, because it means the Jedi made a choice, not just to protect a child, to protect a power structure, their own eventual hoped-for restoration by ensuring the most dangerous man in the galaxy remained emotionally isolated, remained without a son, remained in a grief so total that the only thing he could channel it into was obedience. The separation was mercy. But mercy for whom? Consider the mechanics of how Luke is actually raised. Owen Lars is not warm. He is not nurturing in the conventional sense. He is a man defined by anxiety about the desert, about the rebels, about anything that might bring attention to a boy with a particular surname and a particular name who should, by all rights, not exist. He tells Luke almost nothing. He clips Luke's ambitions at every opportunity. He wants Luke to be invisible, to be a moisture farmer, to be someone the galaxy never looks at twice. That is what the Jedi arranged for Luke Skywalker. Invisibility, smallness, a horizon that goes nowhere. Now ask what Vader would have arranged instead. Not cruelty, not darkness as a starting point. A father who was, before the fall, the greatest pilot in the Republic's history. A man who had trained under the Order's most intellectually rigorous knight. A man who had fought on the front lines of a galactic war from the age of 9 and who had survived every impossible situation he had ever encountered through a combination of raw forceability and a refusal to accept limitation. That is the man who would have raised Luke Skywalker. What happens next reframes everything. Because a Luke raised by Vader is not a Luke raised in darkness, not initially. He is a Luke raised in competence, in intensity, in the understanding that the galaxy does not accommodate weakness and that the Force is not a background hum but a presence that demands to be engaged. He would have learned to fly before he could walk. He would have understood political architecture because his father sat at the right hand of the Emperor. He would have known what the Jedi Order was, not from Obi-Wan's careful, curated mythology, but from the perspective of a man who had watched them operate up close and had concluded they were structurally incapable of surviving their own contradictions. And here is what the official story never survives. Luke, as written, wins because he believes in something the Jedi told him to believe in. He trusts the mythology. He trusts the vision of his father that Obi-Wan constructed the good man destroyed by Vader, the person worth saving. That mythology is Luke's weapon against the Emperor as much as any lightsaber. Without it, he doesn't walk into the throne room expecting redemption. He walks in knowing the man in black is his father, trained by him, shaped by him, and entirely aware of how the galaxy actually functions. That Luke is not Luke Skywalker as we know him. He might be something considerably more dangerous. There is a version of this scenario that the galaxy never survives, and it is not the obvious one. The easy assumption is that Vader raises Luke as an apprentice, another Sith, another weapon, another dark side practitioner in a long line of them, loyal to the Emperor until the Emperor decides he's a liability. That version ends with Palpatine dead, Luke on a throne, the Sith lineage continuing. It is a darker galaxy, but a structurally recognizable one. Power replacing power. Evil in a new shape. That version, however, requires Vader to remain loyal to Palpatine after knowing Luke exists. And that loyalty, as we have established, was built entirely on grief, on absence, on the understanding that there was nothing worth protecting except the mission Palpatine gave him. The moment Luke exists, Palpatine's control over Vader has a fault line running through its center, and Vader would have known that Palpatine would see it too. This is the implication that most analyses of this scenario miss entirely because they focus on Luke's development and not on the political mechanics of what a father-son pair at the heart of the Empire would have meant for the Emperor's long game. Palpatine spent decades constructing a situation where he was the only source of meaning for the beings closest to him. Vader broken, the Senate dissolved, the Jedi exterminated. Every institution that could generate loyalty outside of Palpatine himself was systematically dismantled. This was not paranoia. This was engineering. A child changes that engineering, because a child is loyalty that Palpatine did not create and cannot control. A child is someone Vader would protect before he protected the Emperor, and Palpatine, who had watched Anakin throw away his future for Padme, understood exactly how catastrophic that priority inversion would be. He had, in a very real sense, already seen it happen. He had watched Anakin choose love over institution once. He could not afford to watch it happen again. This implies that even if Vader had discovered Luke's existence, even if the secret had surfaced at any point during Luke's childhood, Palpatine would have moved immediately to neutralize the threat. Not by killing Luke, that would have been counterproductive. By controlling the access, by positioning himself as the mediating presence between father and son, by ensuring that Luke's loyalty, if it developed, was to the Empire and to Palpatine, not to a private father-son bond that left no room for an emperor. The most likely explanation for how that scenario unfolds is the most disturbing one. Palpatine would have given Vader his son, willingly, with elaborate ceremony, and then spent the next decade inserting himself into the relationship at every possible level as mentor, as grandfather figure, as the source of Luke's education and advancement and opportunity, until the bond between father and son was inseparable from the bond between both of them and the Emperor. Until Vader's love for Luke was expressed, was only expressible through Palpatine's approval. Until Luke's respect for his father was indistinguishable from his respect for the Emperor, they both served. That is not an apprentice. That is a dynasty. And dynasties, unlike apprentices, are very difficult to destroy from the outside. The rebellion's entire strategic logic rested on the Emperor's isolation, on the fact that Vader served out of compulsion, that the Imperial officers served out of fear and ambition, that there was no true belief underneath the architecture of the Empire, only force and inertia. A Luke raised within that system, trained by his father, positioned as heir to the Emperor's power, would have provided the one thing the Empire was structurally missing: a story worth believing, a future worth serving. A man who represented not the cold machinery of Palpatine's control, but something that looked, from the outside, like continuity, like succession, like the Empire choosing its next shape deliberately rather than holding together through sheer momentum. That Luke would not have needed to destroy the rebellion through force. He would have needed only to wait for it to lose faith in itself. And here's the detail that changes how we see the saga entirely. Luke Skywalker, as raised by Owen Lars, wins because he wants something the Empire cannot offer him. He wants his father back. He wants redemption to be possible. He wants the story Obi-Wan told him of a good man lost, of a galaxy worth saving to be true. That want is a vulnerability. The Emperor tries to use it against him in the throne room. He tries to turn Luke's love into rage, his hope into despair. He fails because Luke's attachment to the idea of his father is stronger than his attachment to his own survival. A Luke raised by Vader does not have a mythologized father to recover. He has a present one. And a present father is not a wound that can be exploited. It is a source of gravity, a fixed point. Something real in a way that Obi-Wan's careful construction of the ghost of Anakin Skywalker never quite was. Which raises a darker possibility. If Luke, raised by Vader, never develops the specific emotional architecture that the Emperor tries to weaponize in Return of the Jedi, if the leverage of a lost father, a father worth saving, is simply not present, then Palpatine's final gambit does not exist. The Emperor's trap at the Death Star 2 depended on understanding Luke's psychology, on understanding what Luke wanted more than victory, on knowing that Luke would walk into the trap willingly because his father's soul was worth more to him than his own safety. A Luke who grew up with his father does not make that calculation. He has different values, different pressure points, different definitions of what is worth dying for. The Emperor, facing that Luke, would have needed a completely different strategy. And it would explain why Palpatine was so careful for so long to ensure Vader never knew the truth. It was not about protecting Vader from distraction. It was about protecting the trap he was building for 20 years. There is a consequence that no version of this scenario escapes, and it is the one that reframes the entire saga in retrospect. If Vader had raised Luke, if the separation never happened, if the lie never took root, then the rebellion as we know it does not exist in its current form, not because it is crushed, because its moral center is different, because the story the Alliance tells itself of good against evil, of the light against the dark, of a young man from nowhere who represents something the Empire can never manufacture, requires Luke to be from nowhere, requires him to be innocent, requires him to be someone the galaxy did not make. A Luke raised in the Empire is the Empire's child, even if he eventually turns against it. Even if he becomes, through some internal reckoning we can barely imagine, a man who decides his father's world is wrong, he carries its logic inside him. He knows how it thinks. He knows what it values. He knows where its pressure points are in a way that the Luke who grew up watching binary sunsets never could. That Luke is more dangerous to the Empire than any other version, and more dangerous to the rebellion. Because a man who understands power from the inside, who was raised in it and chose against it, does not fight with hope. He fights with architecture. He knows which pillars to remove. He knows which loyalties are real and which are performed. He knows the Emperor's psychology, not from Jedi teaching, but from 2 decades of proximity. That Luke does not need a mentor. He needs only a reason. And here's what the consequence ultimately reveals about the original trilogy's design. The story we were given Luke on Tatooine, ignorant and aching, Vader hunting rebels with no knowledge of what he hunts, Obi-Wan waiting in a desert for a moment that may never come, is not the safest version of events. It is the version that was most useful for the people who arranged it. Yoda and Obi-Wan did not place Luke in hiding because it was guaranteed to work. They placed him there because every other scenario required them to trust Anakin Skywalker's love for his child to overcome his loyalty to the Emperor. And they had already decided, on Mustafar, that Anakin Skywalker was gone. That decision that a man was irredeemable, that the darkness had taken him completely, that the only option was to separate the children and wait, was made by people who had already failed him once, who had failed to see what he needed, what he feared, what he was becoming, until it was too late, who had built an order so committed to the suppression of attachment that a man died alone on the inside for years before he finally broke. Those are the people who decided that hiding Luke was mercy, and they may have been right about the outcome. The story ends, after all, with Vader carrying the Emperor across the throne room and throwing him into the reactor core. The love for his son that Palpatine tried for 20 years to prevent does, in the end, do exactly what Palpatine feared it would do. The vulnerability Obi-Wan used to hide Luke away becomes, in Return of the Jedi, the only weapon that actually works. But that is not the same as saying the choice was made for the right reasons, because the consequence of hiding Luke is not only that Luke grows up safe. The consequence is that Vader spends 19 years in a suit, in service to a man who murdered his wife and lied about it, with no knowledge that anything worth protecting still exists. 19 years. The consequence is every planet the Death Star obliterates, every system that submits out of fear because there is no one inside the Empire making a different argument, every voice that goes silent, because the man who might have questioned the Emperor never had a reason to. The consequence is a galaxy that suffers for 2 decades because the people who could have prevented it decided that managing Anakin Skywalker was safer than trusting him. And if that's what happened, if the hiding of Luke was as much about Jedi strategy as it was about a child's safety, then we have to ask one final question about the story we were told. When Obi-Wan tells Luke in the desert that Darth Vader betrayed and murdered his father when he delivers the most consequential half-truth in the saga, is he lying to protect Luke from grief? Or is he lying to protect himself from the thing Luke would inevitably ask if he knew the truth? Why didn't you go back for him? There is no clean answer to that question. There is no version of it that leaves Obi-Wan entirely innocent. And there is no version of the original trilogy that looks quite the same once you ask it, because the story of Luke Skywalker, hero of the rebellion, last hope of the Jedi, is also the story of a boy who was placed in a desert by people who had already given up on his father, who was raised in ignorance not only to keep him safe from Vader, but to keep him available, pure, uncomplicated, emotionally legible for the role the Jedi needed him to play. A Luke raised by Vader would not have been available for that role. He would have been something the Jedi could not have scripted. And the question that sits at the center of everything, the question this scenario forces into the open, is not what Luke would have become under his father's influence. It is whether the people who made that choice were afraid of Vader raising a monster, or afraid of Vader raising someone they couldn't control. The implication is hard to ignore. And if you sit with it long enough, it doesn't stay confined to Luke. It starts to move backward through the saga, touching every decision the Jedi made about Anakin Skywalker from the moment they first saw him on Tatooine, a 9-year-old boy who was already more powerful than anyone they had trained, who loved his mother with a ferocity that made the Council visibly uncomfortable, who was told from his very first day in the temple that what he felt was a problem to be managed. They never trusted him, and when he fell, they never went back. They took his children and called it protection. And if that's what you call protection, what else have we been calling by the wrong name? If you want more Star Wars truths that are rarely examined, you know where to find them. Subscribe to the channel, and before you go, leave a comment below with this. If Vader had raised Luke, do you think Luke would have eventually turned against him, or would the bond have been too strong to break? The galaxy is still deciding.